Morning. So I'll try and give a little bit of background to the specific theme or title that we've chosen for this public editorial meeting, which is deals with the notion of the people, and try to relate that both to the categories of art and politics. So in his book Short Voyages to the Land of the People, Jacques Rancière describes a series of encounters in the form of very short travels, and these encounters are with the people itself. What could that mean, a short voyage to the land of the people? These voyages are all done, by the way, by authors and artists who find the people, who find themselves in the people, and subsequently takes it upon themselves to represent the people in their work. So, as always in Rancière's work, it is of course a book about the meeting between aesthetics and politics. And he describes, actually on the very first page of this book, these encounters in the following way, I quote, "This is a book about voyages, not so much to far-off isles or exotic vistas, as to those much closer lands that offer the visitor the image of another world. Just across the straits, away from the river, off the beaten path, at the end of the subway line, there lives another people," and then he puts in parentheses, "unless it is quite simply the people. We are offered the unexpected spectacle of another humanity in its many figures." And he then mentions three. So the quote with this: "The return to origins, the descent to the netherworld, and the arrival of the promised land." This all sounds like titles of exhibitions, I think. Now, with these unexpected, while these unexpected spectacles, literally they're just at the end of the subway line, so that would be Highbury in one end and West Croydon in the other, they may dazzle in their depths. It would seem just this short trip, and you find yourself, you return to your origins, you descend to the netherworld, you arrive in the promised land. One cannot help but be puzzled by the ease with which one supposedly finds oneself there. As he says, just across the straits, the end of the subway line. Furthermore, the seamlessness of the encounter itself is impressive. Just take a short but brisk walk, and you'll find yourself among the people, and you will find yourself to be one of the people. However, I would argue that in artistic production, as well as in political articulation, finding the right path and conjuring up images and imaginations of the people, or for that matter, constructing the people as a political entity or block, is arguably, more often than not, all but a short voyage, but rather a somewhat long march. Indeed, it is a road filled with obstacles and detours. One often gets delayed, derailed, or simply lost. It is a wayward, swerving, and long-winded journey, and one that very often does not reach its destination. So within the arts, I would say, contra Rancière, that it's always a long walk to the land of the people. Indeed, no notion holds a more central, if controversial, place in contemporary art discourse than the notion of the public, the people, or the audience. It's almost as if audience cannot be separated from the institution of art itself, from how an art institution operates, and particularly these days, is justified and measured. Audiences are often listed as the primary reason for cultural production. At the same time, of course, for all those working in this business, audiences are often viewed as troublesome and unappreciative. It's an entity to call into being, but also to call into question. And it's always as much an imagined ideal as it is a social reality. In a sense, an institution of art is never more or less than its audience, although this in no way, of course, indicates any kind of smooth relationship. Indeed, it is rather it's rather an asymmetrical one. It's a relationship of desire, projection, and conflict. Furthermore, this codependent but far from seamless relationship is also one that has to be established in both a temporal and spatial sense, so as in the formation of a public. There needs to be a location, a place in which it can become a public, in the form of a collective body rather than a number of individuals, and it is a particular place or occasion that produces this public. So, in his writing on publics, Michael Warner calls this a kind of chicken and egg circularity that confront us with the idea of the public. And this means that on the one hand, a public exists only by the virtue of being addressed, like this public here today, while on the other hand, only public speaking and services exist for this public. So in other words, an art institution cannot exist without a public to address, while simultaneously it must produce this public through its mode of address. So this is the conundrum that faces, particularly, of course, curatorial work. It is this double bind that makes audience relations problematic as well, since there is no guarantee that a specific mode of address actually succeeds in producing its public, or moreover one of a sufficient size or of the desired kind, or in any kind of sustainable form. Of course, this production of the public, or we could say of the people, has gone through various historical and theoretical models in the modern and postmodern eras in order to gain a very precise and specific meaning in the current world system. So if at the outset of modernity, and here I quote Fraser Ward, the museum contributed to the self-representation and self-authorization of the new bourgeois subject of reason, end of quote, then post-modernity brought about a fundamental unhinging of this relationship between institution and audience, since both sides of the equation were deconstructed and brought into perpetual suspension and renegotiation. So on the one hand, the role of the institution was criticized, we know it from institutional critique, etc. On the other hand, of course, it was expanded. I think this is a dual attack, actually. This kind of expansiveness of art. On the one hand, the museum boom, the boom of building museums all over the former West, and also the idea that art could be a social practice. So these challenged and reached beyond the traditional public of the institution. On the other hand, as I already said, the notion of the audience itself has, of course, by artists and theorists been questioned and transformed, ultimately leading to the still unanswered question of what should come in place of the public sphere. In other words, if the institution can produce its audience, which mode of address would produce a different audience, and with it a totally different conception of audience and therefore people and society as such? There have, of course, been several responses to this query within artistic practice, within artistic art theory, and of course within art institutional policies and formats. And actually these responses, I think, can be narrated as a series of voyages, as a series of encounters, sort of like Rancher's short voyages to the land of the people, but with the difference, I think, that these are as much about the impossibility as the possibility for constructing a we. And I think they can now be periodicized as what was the self-image of the West and of modernity, and can therefore be redescribed and reinscribed under the proposition that is former West, that Maria also mentioned, of course. Indeed, the notion of a former West implies not just something past, but also something remaining, a hauntology, you could say. And I would argue that contemporary art lives within the spectre not so much of modernity, but rather of spectatorship and of spectacle, and perhaps, therefore, in the spectre of a certain type of postmodernity. And I will just take two examples of this journey, take two stops on this journey, which are both has to do with artistic practice after 1989. And they would be, on the one hand, so-called community art, and on the other hand, the now mostly maligned concept of relational aesthetics. These are both, I think, primary forms of a kind of former West art history of art after 1989. So I will read them in that way specifically. So relational aesthetics first. I think in many ways, of course, this epitomized the ideology of a triumphant West after 1989 and the ideas of an end of history and an end of utopia in favor of some sort of endless equilibrium of electorate democracy and the free market and the construction of a so-called third way of politics. Maybe a lot of people have forgotten, but this was very much in vogue in the 1990s from Tony Blair and others, the idea of a third way of politics, where there was no longer left or right, but only right and wrong, etc. For relational aesthetics, the problem was how to avoid the spectacle, but still stage an audience, and still create a relation that was primarily aesthetic in nature. So it operated in a marked contrast to divergent yet politicized aesthetics of the kind of institutional critique and also community art. Relational aesthetics concerned itself not with representation, but rather with what its main theorist, of course, Nicolas Bourriaud, called, very interestingly, social interstice and relational form. Indeed, of course, Bourriaud tried to construct an art historical category and a generational project of the art of the 1990s. And it was also a response to Guy Debord's famous critique of the society of spectacle and art's implication in that. Bourriaud's argument was twofold. On the one hand, he agreed with Guy Debord's critique of the spectacle, but he disagreed with the idea of culture or fine art being part of the spectacle. So he parceled it out from the society of spectacle. According to Bourriaud, Debord's analysis was limited to capitalist forms of exchange under the regime of representation, whereas relational art of the 1990s, again according to Bourriaud, offered a rich loam for social experiments and a space partly protected from the uniformity of behavioral systems. So this move from the representational to the relational made it possible for Bourriaud to once again privilege the space of art as a space for a particular encounter. So you could also say a specific construction of the people. Contrary to what Debord believed, Bourriaud saw this encounter not as a space of contestation or struggle, but as a space for social exchange exempt from commodification. Again, I quote, "The work that forms a relational work and social interstice updates situationism and reconciles it as far as possible with the art world." End of quote. So of course, whether one now would still accept Bourriaud's, what sounds now like a fairly provocative claim, hinges on whether you think that the art world and its institutions can now still, if it could in the 1990s, provide a space exempt from commodity exchange. So the other example, of course, that's contemporaneous to it, would be the notion of community art, which of course shares some formal traits with relational aesthetics, but obviously it has a quite different ideology and different self-understanding. Now, if a community can be identified, it can also be addressed as purely special, as typical, or as having universal or even universalizing qualities. An artist or cultural institution can then focus on this specific community by representing, provoking, or accommodating it. So the shift from the kind of a modernist ideology of the white cube and its hidden universality towards the idea of identifiable specific communities outside the traditional spaces of art owes in part to an acknowledgement of a particular social and aesthetic lack. While the work had been conditioned on a specific site or space, it now became directed to a certain group or constituency. So this idea of the neutrality of the gallery space in community art is viewed as false and as socially tilted towards a certain group, the upper classes, and their cultural rule and political hegemony, while other social groups, regarded as underrepresented or even unrepresented, and therefore powerless, and working with and in the community was thus seen as a path towards empowerment, of allowing for cultural recognition and subsequent political access and power. However, this movement also assumed that the excluded communities already existed, and furthermore, that they could be identified and therefore represented. This idea has, of course, since been heavily criticized, if not wholly discredited, on two major points that both have to do, in my mind, with the mode of address employed by the particular community project, and how it can be said to not represent and visualize the community, but rather produces the community as a particular identity. The construction of the identity of a community through identification was, of course, at the crux of the art historian Mi-Won Kwon's critique of community-based art. She used the term that it had an, and I quote, idealized spectre of community. So again, we come to the notion of the spectre. This was a fixing of identity that partly overshadows any inherent conflicts and differences within the community by claiming innate unity or universality, and moreover tends towards an essentializing and typecasting of the community, if not downright victimization and stigmatization of this particular group. So it's a fairly harsh critique of community art as she saw it. She wrote, this is also in the 1990s, "It has become commonplace in public art to cast the community as the victimized yet resilient other that continuously tests the stability of prevailing socio-political and economic conditions." In lieu of this production of the community, however, participatory and self-representing, Kwon suggested the notion of unsighting the very idea of a coherent political community through a process of reflection in regards to the governmentality implied in the endeavor of community art. Interestingly, though, governmentality for Kwon was not located in the artistic process, but in the commissioning and funding bodies, that is, in an institutional intervention, requiring thus an artistic and political response in the form of institutional critique or return to institutional critique. An opposite view, of course, is held by another American art historian. So this is a very American concern somehow, which would be Grant Kester, and his linkage of community with communicability. Kester understood communication, that communication needs not only a sender and a receiver, but that this relation must be inscribed in a social bond of recognition. So that's in direct contrast to Mi-Won's focus on misrecognition. So for Kester, the main critical difference does not reside between community art and reflexive art practices such as institutional critique or, for that matter, relational aesthetics, but rather between different forms of community and the ways in which art engages with them. Community art may indeed be misrepresentative, as Kwon fundamentally saw it as, but it can also be, for Kester, truly dialogical. It cannot only detract from, but also add to the identity of the community, translating thus quite literally into what he calls community building. The distinction is one between politically coherent and incoherent communities. These are his terms, that there exist politically coherent and politically incoherent communities. I think now we only have politically incoherent communities. So with the former understood as one that is self-instituted and therefore politically engaged around certain social issues and questions of identity, and the latter established and designated through outside artistic intervention and or institutional inscription. So whereas the first approach makes political representation through artistic modes of participation possible and valuable, in the second category, artistic representations of politically incoherent communities are always forms of ethical and epistemological violation, forms of misrecognition. This is, in Kester's words, I think this is again an interesting phrase, about, I quote, the difference between naming and being named, and the profoundly different forms of political agency that each of these actions represents. So, end of quote. So, I think regardless of whether one agrees with Kester's separation between coherent and incoherent communities, which is somehow an unacceptable distinction in my mind, the question in relation to artistic production as a mode of address remains whether any similar distinction can be made between naming and being named. Because what is representation after all, if not the double bind between naming and being named, and the constant oscillation between activation, and pacification. In terms of artistic institutions, I think we can see that a kind of influence from actually from both these forms in terms of how they deal with its audience. And we're witnessing now, I think, on the one hand, a kind of legacy of community art and the idea of social outreach, the idea of naming, the idea of counting and measuring the audience. On the other hand, we of course see the idea of not just measuring and counting, but also counting as many as possible, which is sort of understood as a kind of populism within art institutions. And this is what you could call, or some have called anyway, a kind of commercial mode of address, right? And it's probably no surprise that this commercial mode has, in tandem with community-directed outreach, become the dominant model of audience interaction within the current world hegemony, wherein audience is understood primarily in terms of numbers. And you could say that this is kind of ideology of financialization, where audiences are seen not in terms of a public or a community for that matter, but solely in terms of counting and accounting. Indeed, the main demand placed on art institutions today, those who work in them, who are in this room will know what I'm talking about, is that they not only sustain audience numbers, but constantly strive to increase them. Right? The art institution is understood as merely one among many sites of leisure and infotainment, as much as enlightenment. And they must try to increase its audience count through blockbuster exhibitions, further transforming the traditional bourgeois public sphere of the museum into an entertainment complex. But this should give us reason to pause, and not in the usual way of thinking this is only horrible, because what exactly is a blockbuster exhibition? So the term, of course, comes from Hollywood film production, where it seems to indicate a format that works on a large scale, with a large institutional apparatus and a large budget, followed by a sizable audience. If this is indeed the case, then like many blockbuster films that turn out to be huge flops at the box office, the blockbuster exhibition cannot be an assured success. Moreover, that something has a blockbuster format or intention surely does not tell us all we need to know about what is shown in it, or how it is shown, and what method of mediation is employed in its display. So do audiences act in the same way in every blockbuster or mega exhibition? Are mega exhibitions always entertaining or even superficial? Or in other words, is entertainment truly the antithesis of knowledge and critique? Do blockbuster exhibitions by definition produce spectators rather than citizens, and is this even a proper distinction? Unquestionably, in the art world, mega exhibitions have a bad reputation, probably owing in large part to the legacy, I think, of Guy Debord's critique of the spectacle. This is no doubt further compounded by the corporate style of presentation in large institutions themselves, particularly with the public relations material, which art critics always receive first before seeing the show. You get these really annoying press releases. And of course, the architecture of major museums that tend to make them almost indistinguishable from airports or shopping malls. Indeed, blockbuster exhibitions are now something that the curators who do them almost feel the need to apologize for, right? It's almost as if though it's a necessary evil in the quest for audiences and the appeasal of funders and backers of institutions, governments, foundations, etc. So it's like we do the blockbuster exhibitions because we have to, and then we try to do all the other interesting stuff on the side. So blockbusters are seen in this discourse as powerful but not empowering. And if they are popular, they are also, in a word, of course, always accused of being populist. And it's to this notion of populism and its relation to the populace and the construction of the we, or the collective we, that I would now like to turn by looking at the writings on populism from the late Ernesto Laclau, who wrote, of course, about populism as a way of constructing the people and as synonymous with the political itself. So whereas populism is usually used as a derogatory term, in his book of 2005 entitled On Populist Reason, Laclau made a kind of strong, passionate defense for populism as a political strategy that can form, or even as the only political strategy, that can form collective identities and identifications, and do so through affect and articulation, of course. He did so, and I quote from the introduction, "Because of the suspicion, which I have had for a long time, that in the dismissal of populism, far more is involved than the relegation of a peripheral set of phenomena to the margins of social explanation. What is involved in such a disdainful rejection is the dismissal of politics tout court, and the assertion that the management of community is the concern of an administrative power whose source of legitimacy is a proper knowledge of what a good community is." End of quote. Laclau goes on to praise the very vagueness of the concept and calls it no less, this is interesting because we started with voyages, long walks, short walks, he calls actually populism, I quote, "the royal road to understanding something about the ontological constitution of the political as such," end of quote. So it's the royal road. It is thus not a political ideology that belongs to the right, as in the current discussions about the undeniable emergence of right-wing populism in Europe and beyond, but rather the device through which the imaginary entity, the people, is rhetorically produced as real social agency. Indeed, he even characterizes the people as the discursive production of emptiness, which had to do, of course, with how it's constructed through empty signifiers and a constitutive social lack. So we see the Lacanian heritage here. But why lack and emptiness rather than belonging and history? So these traditional terms of the people. Here Laclau states, and I will quote at length, "One first dimension of the break is that at its root there is the experience of a lack, a gap which has emerged in the harmonious continuity of the social. There is a fullness of the community which is missing. This is decisive. The construction of the people will be the attempt to give a name to that absent fullness." I think this is a very accurate description of what former West actually is as a concept. It's that absent fullness. But he goes on, "Without this initial breakdown of something of the social order, however minimal that something could initially be, there is no possibility of antagonism, frontier, or ultimately the people. This initial experience is not only, however, an experience of the lack. The lack, as we have seen, is linked to a demand which is not met." So linked to a demand that is not met. "This involves bringing into the picture the power which has not met the demand. A demand is always addressed to somebody. So from the very beginning we are confronted with a dichotomic division between unfulfilled social demands on the one hand and an unresponsive power on the other." End of quote. So if we take this at face value, there are a number of conclusions to be drawn. First, of course, simply that the people does not exist organically, say in a nation, in an identity, within a territory, but only through discourse and articulation. And furthermore, that the people as a political category, as a collective we, only emerges in conflict or in crisis. By making demands, so the demand is constitutive of the people, and creating a dividing line between the people and those in power. So I'll finish with just two examples of political slogans about the people from the beginning of the former West era and at our present time, so in the time span between 1989 and now. So in 1989, of course, when the revolutions happened at the end of the communist countries in Eastern Europe, and the kind of revolutions there, popular revolutions there in one country after another, in the German Democratic Republic, which was one of the last countries to have an anti-communist revolution, 1989 in November. While this state was crumbling, those in power started negotiating with various other political groups about a new constitution. Till after the dismantlement of communism, there was still this moment of uncertainty, of crisis. What would be the new German Democratic Republic. This is before the idea of unification had even entered the picture. So while this was being discussed, protesters took to the streets saying, "We are the people." So this was the slogan. And of course it was directed to the remnants of the Communist Party that was supposed to represent the people. Instead, protesters took to the street and said, "No, we are the people. Look at us, we are the people." Yeah, so, and then of course we need to think, what does it mean now when a slogan such as "We are the 99% is used? How does that play into this notion of solidarity and precarity? What is the dividing line that's created? You can say it's towards the 1%, but who exactly are the 99%? So I hope we will be able to discuss this over the next 2 days, and that you will all be happy to take a walk with us. And then we'll see if it becomes a short voyage to the land of the people, the royal road to the political itself, or, as I suggested, a long and troublesome way towards defining the people. Thank you.